Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in today's video, we're going to be talking CSS frameworks, specifically how to build your own and why you might want to do that. Now, this isn't going to be some big, robust 4,000 line framework. It's going to be very minimal, and we're going to build it as needed, which means it's only going to have the things that we're going to use in our design. Now, before we get started, I do want to talk about why you would create a CSS framework versus using an existing CSS framework, because there are a ton of really cool CSS frameworks available, and why not just grab one of those off the shelf, drop it in, and use it? Well, you certainly can, but one of the things I worry about a little bit with that approach is the clashing of opinions. So Oxygen has a lot of default styles, almost like its own framework. And then you're going to add another set of default styles and opinions on top of that, and they're probably going to run into each other. Best case is some of the styles from the framework just won't work. Worst case is they actually clash in a way that breaks your designs, and it can become really counterintuitive to kind of figure out where the styles are coming from and which one's going to override which. So that's why I'm a big fan of kind of rolling your own as you need it in Oxygen, because you can kind of work around the defaults and work with the defaults instead of fighting them. Now, I do want to note there are some frameworks that are built to work with builders like Oxygen, and these kind of do the job of working with Oxygen's defaults and should completely avoid the issue of collisions like I was previously talking about. But then we get into my next point, which is the size of these frameworks. Taking a look at something like Pico.css, which is a super minimalist CSS framework, it has about 2,600 lines of CSS in the unminified file. And even after minification, the raw file is 74 kilobytes. Now that's going to be much smaller after gzip compression, which is the number that will be more impactful for your users, but that's still not completely negligible. So it's something to consider if you're really min-maxing the performance of your site. And on top of that, you can also end up with just a bunch of extra stuff you're not going to end up using. Now, the purpose-built frameworks that work with Oxygen and were built to work with Oxygen, and some of them that pull in like Tailwind and stuff, they can purge unused stuff, and that's great, but that requires a whole separate plugin and things like that. You can also purge from normal CSS frameworks if you're using a build step. I think most of the big ones offer that option, but that's just a whole lot. If you don't need everything that framework's going to offer, at least most of it, it just feels like a lot of extra work. I'm a big proponent of kind of using the framework mentality to build out your own style sheet so that you wind up with a super minimal purpose-built CSS framework that can then be reused across your other sites, because this will match your build style and should not have a bunch of unused extra stuff. So with all that said, the process in this video is going to be a process of building things out, adding classes, and then beginning to build our framework around that. So we're only creating parts of our framework as we need it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I am going to be using Emmet to add elements to my design. This is built into Oxygen as of version 4.5 and can really speed things up, especially when you want to add classes as you're building. So we'll hit Command or Control Shift E to open up our Emmet input there in the add pane. And the first thing I want to build is a hero section. So we'll just say section. We're going to drop in a section, but we want a class on that because I do want there to be a gap between the elements in this section. So this is where we get into making decisions about what types of classes to use. What I'm going to show you today combines CSS variables or custom properties with utility classes and component classes. If you're not familiar with those terms, we'll cover that as we start building things out. But I will say that this is going to be a utility class because I'm going to use it on multiple elements. So we'll say oxy-gap, and I'm going to use this oxy prefix for all of my classes. So there's our section. Now we need some text. Now this text is going to be an overline. Now I have to ask myself, am I going to have overline text in other locations? Because if I am, I want to use either a component class or a utility class. Probably in this case, since it is an overline element and I'm not applying just some specific style, I'll use a component class. So we'll call it oxy overline. And then we'll just add some text with curly brackets here. We'll say overline. And then below that, I'm going to use this sibling combinator here, which is just a plus sign We're going to add a heading. So we'll do an H2, heroes section. Again, I'm adding text with curly braces. And then we're going to add just some text. And then finally, a button. Now this for sure is going to be a component. Again, I'll get into the philosophy of utility versus component a little bit more as we start writing our CSS. But basically, if it's a self-contained element, it's basically going to be a component. If it's a class that's going to apply a single property, then it's going to be a utility class. But first we need to add our link wrapper. Then we can add our class by just typing dot and then the class name, and we'll do Oxy button. And then inside that, we need some text that says learn more. Now we'll hit enter to execute that, and boom, we've got our structure. I really like building this way because it forces you to kind of think about things as you go, and you can kind of architect in a way that is a little more difficult to do when you're just visually dropping elements in. So now that we have our first bit of stuff to style, let's jump into some CSS here. So I'm going to pull this over to the side, and then over in our WordPress admin panel, I'm going to go to Oxygen Style Sheets. Now, a couple of things I want to do here. First, I already have a style sheet. If you don't have one, you'll need to create one. We're going to go ahead and set this to lock sheets in the builder, which means we can make changes in the builder without overriding our CSS from our style sheet. And then we're going to turn on hot reload. Now, once those options are on, we are going to need to refresh both the builder and the front end to ensure those options are loaded. Now we can full screen this over here and we can start making changes. Now, since we're in our CSS, let's start organizing our framework. So we're going to add a comment. We'll call this variables. And we're going to add a root selector, which is just going to target the HTML element on your page. This is where we're going to declare all of our variables. We'll come back to this in a minute because I want to create variables as needed. I don't know everything I'm going to need until I start using it. So now we created three classes with this section. One was a utility, so let's add a utility section here, and let's add a component section here. Keep everything nice and organized so that we can find it easily and it makes sense. So our utility classes we added were, I believe, Oxy-Gap, and that may have been the only one. And then we had two component classes. We had Oxy-Overline and Oxy-Button. So now we can go ahead and add our utility class property. So getting back into variables, utilities, and components, which are basically how we're dividing our framework up. Variables are going to be individual properties that are going to be reused multiple places within our CSS. So if Overline is going to use, just for example, font size 32 pixels, and then Button is going to use font size 32 pixels, that should be a variable. So then when we go up here and do Oxy font size 32 pixels, then we can go down here, and instead of having to track these two, if we ever change them, since we probably never want them to be different than each other, we're going to go ahead and do var Oxy font size in both locations. So there's our general rule of thumb. If we're going to use the same value in two places in our CSS, let's use a variable. Now let's back this up and let's talk about utilities. That's our next section. Utilities are single property classes, basically. So a utility should only have one declaration. So in this case, Oxy-Gap is going to add a gap. So we'll do gap 32 pixels. And we'll go ahead and save that, and you'll see that reload over there on the right-hand side. Now, the reason that didn't apply is, again, we're getting into these complexities of working with a builder. In Oxygen, a section isn't just a section. We applied this Oxy-Gap class to our section, but the section has an inner container that needs this gap applied to it. So just applying the gap to the section doesn't work. So what we need to do is, because we're going to use this gap both for sections and for other elements, we need to first have a selector that excludes the outer section wrapper. So we can do that by doing not and then CT section as a class there. So now this will no longer apply to the section itself, the outer wrapper of the section. But to get it to apply to the inner wrapper of the section, which is where our elements live and where we want the actual gap, we have to do Oxy-Gap and then a direct child combinator, and then another class, which is CT section inner wrap. Let's see if I didn't typo that. We'll save, and then our hot reload will refresh, and you see our gap over there on the right-hand side. So these are where an off-the-shelf framework just won't know to do this because they're used to raw HTML. So back to talking about utility classes. Basically, in my mind, a utility class should always have one property, and that property should be reusable across multiple different types of elements. Now we get into component classes. So a button is a great example, but we'll start with the overline. We want our overline to have specific styles. First, we want text transform to be set to uppercase, which won't immediately do anything because we typed our overline in all caps anyways. And then we want our font size to be a little bit smaller than normal. So we'll do font size 0.75 rem or something like that. Let's save that. That'll shrink that down just a little bit for us. And then we do want some letter spacing, and we'll do like 2 pixels or something like that. And that gets us that kind of overline style. You can see this is a more complex class that comprises all the settings that make this thing an overline. So that's why it's a component class. Same with button. It's going to have a bunch of stuff on it. It's going to have, say, padding. We'll do 32 pixels. It's going to have a background color of, say, black, a color of white, and a border radius of, say, 4 pixels. And we'll save that. Now that gets us kind of a button style component. This wouldn't make sense as a utility class because the likelihood of being able to use this exact combination of styles on another element that's not a button is very unlikely. So that's kind of the logic behind using utility versus component classes, and of course variables, which we'll start adding variables as we see repetition in our code. Now let's start building out a new section. So let's go into Oxygen again. We'll bring this over. And we'll refresh so that all of our styles show up for us. Okay, so we have our hero section here. Now, one thing you probably want to do when you're using a framework or especially utility classes that you're not editing in Oxygen is you're going to want to make sure they're selected, and you'll want to go to advanced and click lock selector styles. That'll prevent you from making changes because we do want to make some changes to this section, but we don't want to make those changes on this class. So let's go ahead here. And since this hero is going to be centered, we'll just center everything like that. And then we could add a background image or background gradient or whatever we want. But for this example, we're not going to get too fancy. And this next section will basically use most of the utility classes we need for this small framework. So let's go ahead and hit Command or Control Shift E and open up Emmet. Now what we're going to build is a 4-card layout. So how are we going to do that? First, let's do a section, and we're going to need 2 utility classes on this. We're going to do oxy-gap, which we already created, and then oxy-grid. This is this new kind of magical utility class that I really enjoy. And then inside that, we're going to need a few identical divs or cards. So we're going to do parentheses to enclose this, because outside the parentheses, we can do *4 to multiply it. Now we could go back inside the parentheses and finish up this element. So we'll do a div. Now we could use a component class called oxy-card or something to create this card. But basically everything we're going to apply to this style-wise that makes it a card is also reusable on other elements. So we have, for instance, oxy-gap. We can reuse that anywhere. Then we also say want the corners to be rounded. So we'll do oxy rounded. And then we want it to have a box shadow. We'll do oxy shadow. And then we want it to have some internal padding. So we'll do oxy-padded. So this combination of utility classes makes this look like a card, but we can use those individually across tons of other elements. So this gives us an opportunity to build out our utility class stable while still achieving a card style element. So now that that div's created, we'll drop in a text element, and this will be another overline, and we'll say details for the text. Then that's going to have a sibling after it, and we'll just do an H3, it says card. And then we're going to have some more text, and then we're going to have a link wrapper with the class oxy-button, which we previously created. And inside that, we'll do some more text that says learn more. So now we just hit enter to execute that, and it drops in our entire structure. And you can see, thanks to some of the CSS we've already created, our styles are not super far off. Now what we need to do is flesh out the CSS for the classes we just added. So let's save that. We'll jump up to the front end here, and then we'll scoot back over to our CSS. Now we added a whole mess of utility classes here, so let's just go ahead and type those in. So we had oxy-rounded, we had oxy-shadow, we had oxy-padded, and we had oxy-grid. I may be missing one, but we'll go back and adjust that. Now let's start with padded because this gives us an opportunity to start writing some variables. We want our padding on any element with this padded class to be 32 pixels. But note that we're actually repeating this value in two places here, both for our gap utility class and our padded utility class. So let's go up here and create a variable. We'll do oxy-space, and we'll do 32 pixels. Now let's replace this with our variable. So let's go up here, copy this, then we'll just type var, paste that in. So because we had this repeating value, we took that opportunity to put it into a variable, which means we can now adjust both of these values in one place, which will save us a ton of work later. So let's go ahead and save that. And then let's go to our shadow class, and we'll do a box shadow. Now, I like to use a box shadow generator, so let's jump out to that over here. It's just at brumm.af/shadows. I use this all the time. Usually you'll want to reduce the number of shadows a little bit, but it gives you this nice, natural looking shadow effect. So let's drop that in, and then we can get rid of this generator. Let's save that. Now we have rounded. We're going to set the corners to a border radius of 4 pixels. And again, I see an opportunity for a variable. Now this is getting kind of granular. It depends on what you want to do, but we can do oxy space super small or something like that and just do 4 pixels. Then we can use this variable in 2 locations. We'll do var oxy space super small there. And then down here, we can actually use these variables in our button padding. Now, you might not want to do this. There are cases where this could be maybe making things a little bit too interdependent because there could be times that you want the button to have different padding than your border radius, for example. So if you don't always want these two values to be 4 pixels, you definitely do not want to join them with a variable. But in this case, I think it's pretty safe to do. And you can see here, I have an error in my CSS. That's just a missing curly brace here. So I'm going to drop that in and resave. So now you can see we have basically a card layout with just a few utility classes. And our whole CSS file is still only 43 lines, and we have both the hero section and this card layout. Now we want to get into a slightly more complicated utility class, which is this cool grid class. Now this is another one that's going to be applied to containers. So we need to take Oxygen section architecture into consideration. So we need to do the same thing we did up there for our oxy-gap class. And we need to make sure we apply it not to the CT section outer wrap, but rather to the CT inner wrap. So we'll do oxy grid, direct child, CT section inner wrap. Now we're going to use CSS grid here, which can be a little daunting, but let me tell you that there are some settings for CSS grid that just make it automatically nice. And I'm going to show you one option to set it up that way now. We're going to do display grid, and then we're going to go in and do grid template columns. This is normally where you would declare like 50%, 50% to get 2 50% columns, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do things a little bit more automatically. We're going to do repeat, and then in these parentheses, we're going to do auto fit. Okay, that's really important for this specific application. And then for the next parameter here, we're going to do min max, and then let's do something like 230 pixels. And then our max value will be 1 FR, which is 1 fraction of the width available. So assuming I didn't mess something up there, we should see the effect over on the right-hand side. And spoiler alert, it does collapse gracefully without any responsive settings. So we have a 4-card layout, and as we go down in screen width, we're going to get this kind of effect until it finally collapses to 1 column. So just with 2 lines of CSS, we got a really robust effect that can be used in a few different ways. And I'll show you that next. But first, I want to talk about another variable we can set up. So this 230 pixel minimum is not going to be reused in other places necessarily, but it is kind of a hassle to find and change it. So that's another place where variables can be handy. If you're trying to give yourself or another person an easier time to edit some value hidden in your CSS, then use a variable. So we'll do var, and we'll do this as oxy-grid-min. And then we'll go up here and go ahead and declare that. So we'll do oxy-grid-min 230 pixels. And nothing will change, but now we can have easier access to that value to change it if we want to. Now we're going to jump into Oxygen and build some more stuff out with our little framework, but first let's flesh out a few more things I want in the framework. So one other class that I often find myself using is a transition class. So I'm going to do oxy-transition. And this is actually going to use a variable because we're going to use the same transition value for our buttons. So we'll do transition and then var oxy transition. And then up here, let's go ahead and declare that variable oxy transition. And we'll just pick a value. I usually do something like 0.4 seconds, all ease in out. Now, the nice thing about this is you can add a hover state to any element, then drop the transition class on it, and it's going to smoothly transition from its original to its hover state. So for the button, we're not going to use that transition class, but for anything else that we want to have do something on hover, we'll probably use it. Now let's finish out our button. So this is a slightly more complicated component, so it needs a few different classes. So we're going to do oxy-button hover, and we're going to set some changes there. Let's just do scale 1.1 and opacity 0.95. Barely noticeable, but it'll be something. And then another thing I want to talk about with this padding is instead of adding a whole new variable here, we could have just done this. Calc var oxy-space divided by 4 or 6 or whatever. In this case, we'll do 8 because I think that will wind us up at 4 pixels. So then we could just copy and paste that calc and use it up here where our super small variable was being used. So there's a couple of different approaches for that. You can do it either way, and it should have the exact same result. I like the variable approach because then you don't have to do any math in your head to figure out what that variable's value is going to be. I like the calc approach because it's cleaner and you just have to write less lines of code. All right, so back to our button. We are actually going to add a transition now, and we can use our variable for that, var oxy transition. And you can see here, again, we're using a variable because we wanted the same value for the transition property on the button and the transition property on our utility class for transitions. So this will ensure everything's nice and consistent, even if they're not using the same utility class. Now, since I saved, you can see if I go over here and hover one of these buttons, we get this nice hover effect. Now let's add a secondary button style really quickly, and that'll about wrap up our framework. So we'll do oxy-button, and then because we want to modify this class, we'll do 2 dashes, and we'll do secondary. Now we'll set the background to transparent. We'll set the border color to black. And then we'll set the color to black as well, which will give us a kind of an outline button style that we can use. Now, before we get out of our style sheet, because we're using Oxygen, we can actually use global colors in our style sheet. So what I would probably do if I already had some color set up is I would set up something like oxy-primary and then do color 1. This is going to get the first global color that you've set up. And then you could do oxy secondary, color 2. This is going to get the second global color. So you have to kind of play with this to figure out how to grab the colors that you need depending on where they're at in your color list in Oxygen's global settings. But once you know which one's which, you can actually just map these to a global color, which then gives you the ability to make everything match the rest of your design where you're probably using global colors. Then instead of declaring these colors like black and white down here, we would use these variables. So I think that's the last little change we want to make before we start building some more stuff out. Let's go ahead and scoop this back over, jump into Oxygen, and refresh to ensure we see all of our latest style sheet changes. Now, first, I want to show you the versatility of this grid utility class. So you can see here we have 4 cards. What if we want less? Well, we just delete one and it adjusts. What if we want 2? We delete one If we want more, we duplicate them or add whatever else we want. Now it's only going to have about 4 at the container width that I have set for my Oxygen install. So you might have to adjust that grid minimum size if you want more cards or less, depending on your container width. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And let's add a secondary button up here. Let's go ahead and add a div. And we don't want it inside the button, of course. So we're going to move that out and then move the link wrapper into that div. So let's drop that in there. And then let's duplicate this link wrapper and let's add our modified button class. We'll do oxy-button --secondary. And you can see we get that outline button effect. Now let's make sure this is inside this div with this other button. Make sure it's all arranged how we want. And then let's select that div, set it to horizontal, and add our oxy gap class. Now I think we did miss something on this secondary button class. So let's go back over here and look. In fact, what did we do? We missed the actual border size declaration here. So we're going to do border 1 pixel solid and then transparent. That will ensure our buttons are the same size when they're next to each other so that one has a visible border and one has an invisible border. And then if we look on the front end, that's the result. So now that that's settled, we can go into building another section, and we shouldn't need any new classes for this section. This is the beauty of a framework. It grows a little bit at the beginning, but then eventually you reach a point where you just basically have everything you need. So let's go ahead and open up Emmet again, and we're going to build this basically from scratch just using Emmet. So we're going to do section, oxy-grid, oxy-gap. And in fact, we don't need gap for this one. So we're going to do child combinator. And then this time we aren't going to be multiplying our divs, but we do want to wrap them in parentheses so we don't get confused about what's going on. So we're going to have 2 of them. So I'll go ahead and create my parentheses, and then we'll do div. This one will have oxy-gap, and then we'll drop in a text with the oxy overline class, then an h2 element, then a plain text element, then a link wrapper with the oxy-button and the oxy-button secondary class. Because this is a modifying class, you need that root oxy-button class, or it's missing some of the properties that you'll need to make it look like a button. So that's our left div. I may have missed something there, but we'll add it if we need it. And then on our right div, we just want an image. So we're building kind of a 2-column layout here. So let's drop that in. And you can see just like that, we end up with basically what we wanted. Now, I think I messed something up here with the button. It looks like my text is missing. Let's see. Yeah, so let's add a text element in. And then we can drop in learn more. And let's change this text a little bit. Overline, some details, lipsum 1p. So you can see we get this kind of 2-column layout. We may also want to add our oxy-gap class here to move these away from each other a little bit on the middle. And then on our image, let's see if we can go ahead and set the advanced size and spacing height to 100%. That'll get us a better alignment there. And then we'll go to object fit cover, and object position center will work. Let's see if we have any images here. We'll just use one of our promo images. And just like that, we get this beautiful 2-column setup. Now let's duplicate that and let's reverse these divs, or the div and the image rather. And boom, we have this alternating layout, which we just talked about alternating layouts in one of our basics videos. So we refresh, we come up to the front end, and you see this cool effect that we created in almost seconds because of the work we did with our framework. And this also gives you a little bit of a glimpse of how powerful our Emmet integration can be once you have some CSS classes pre-established that you can just drop onto elements as you add them. So let's scroll through one more time. We have our cool heroes section. We have some cards, which of course collapse down responsively. And speaking of which, these also collapse down responsively, though you are going to have to do some manual tweaks to reorder them. Once they go to a single column, that image is going to be below the text on this one and above the text on that one. You'll probably want to reorder those elements so that the image is always on top. But aside from that, there's not a lot of tweaking that needs to be done when you're using this kind of a setup. Again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's just a quick look at how to build a very minimal CSS framework to save you tons of time and make your workflow more efficient when working with Oxygen. Thank you for watching.